Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Christoph Berner. We're going to be talking about day 4 of Genesis. There's a lot of really weird and odd things going in that text that even ancient translators have noted, and we're going to be talking about those today. And and then it also changes day 1 of Genesis, as well as the beginning and near the last sentence. So there's a lot of weird, odd things going on in the text that really change how we read the text today. So how are you doing today, Dr. Berner?
Thank you. Fine. Thanks for having me.
Yes, very excited for this one. So you wrote an article for Torah.com talking about how Genesis 1, as it was originally written, did not have a 7-day pattern, nor the passage regarding day 1, where light was created. Could you give my audience just a 5 to 10 minute summary of that paper or
Yeah, I'll
article?
try. I'll try. Thank you. Well, the article basically deals with three different observations that have been made for quite a long time. The first one, relates to the Sabbath. There's always been people, even going back to the 18th century, who have claimed that the entire day pattern is not originally part of this text. So this is one thing, and there are of course, certain arguments in favor of this. Perhaps the strongest one is if you look right at the end of the text, you see that there is in verse 1 of Genesis 2 quite a simple statement that the heavens and the earth were finished. And then the text starts anew in verse 2 and says that, well, precisely on the seventh day it was that God finished his creation. So people have always taken this and other observations to say, well, perhaps the text originally was had a much more simple shape and didn't claim that this happened precisely in 7 days. So this is one point. The other two are related to the creation of the luminaries and to this first day where God creates light. And the first point would be, well, how do these two things relate? Because, I mean, once light is created, it takes another 3 days for the luminaries who give light to be created. And this is quite an odd thing, and people have always noticed it and tried to explain this. My second point, and the third point is related to the section on the luminaries, because when you look at this section, that's the verses of Genesis 1:14 through 18, you find quite a few peculiar details, tangents that seem to point to the fact that perhaps there has been some kind of editorial reworking going on in this passage. And I tried to show in this article that these 3 points, the editorial history of the luminary section, the strange relationship between the creation of light and the luminaries and the Sabbath, are in fact related. And all these problems might be solved if we just assume that the Sabbath and the creation of light are part of a later editorial reworking, which has left its traces also in the section on the luminaries, because there are some phrases that adapt this section to the creation of the primordial light in Genesis 1:3-5. So the idea would be that originally this text knew nothing about a pattern of 7 days, neither about the Sabbath, and only told us that, well, in the course of his creation, God also created the luminaries to give light. That's the basic idea. And then someone later on reworked this text to show that this happened precisely in 7 days. Well, why? Because to prepare for the Sabbath. The entire text now, as it stands now, is an etiology for the Sabbath. And that's what I tried to show in this article.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you for the overview there. So, before we really dive into those big details there, could you talk about just any background info it's important to realize about the text of Genesis 1 or the Torah in general, or I'm talking about like dating maybe the specific passage, who was written by, anything that you think's relevant for the conversation.
Mhm. Well, actually, there's not so much. The main thing is that you are open-minded towards accepting the idea that these texts have undergone editorial growth. So that's the main point, and to really look very carefully at the signs we find in the text that seem to hint towards this kind of reworking. That's the main thing you need to really bring in order to follow this argument. And then, of course, I mean, it is in a way helpful to be aware that the text is usually dated to the Persian period, at least in Germany. Most scholars would agree that this first creation account belongs someplace in the Persian period. And in my model, I would add that this reworking that brings in the Sabbath is perhaps something from the early Hellenistic period. Why so? Because the Sabbath is not at all a cornerstone of ancient Israelite religion. In fact, early texts in the Hebrew Bible and all epigraphic records and stuff like that are not aware of a 7-day Sabbath. It's simply not there. And even in the so-called priestly writings, which we have here in Genesis 1, there are not so much traces of the Sabbath once we, go beyond Genesis 1 and 2. So there's very few texts that address the Sabbath, at least in this specific form. So my redaction critical analysis therefore conforms with the general observation that the Sabbath, as we have it right now, and which has become a cornerstone of Jewish identity, that this particular Sabbath seems to be a rather late development in the religious history of Judaism.
Wow. Okay. So just for people that are not as familiar with the dates, so could you tell us approximately when the Persian period and the Hellenistic period are?
Right. So we could say that, just to narrow it down, we could say that the basic version was written around 500 BCE.
Okay.
And that the editorial reworking comes sometime from the 4th century, perhaps. But that's just educated guesswork. Yeah. I mean, the periods are clear, but we cannot date the text precisely to a certain year.
I see. Okay, so just for clarity, so you're talking about, maybe 100 to 300 years, possible wiggle room where these changes might have occurred.
Yes, perhaps. Okay. And they occurred in a context where people saw the need to anchor this crucial observation of the Sabbath, not somewhere in the Sinai legislation where we have an abundant collection of diverse laws, but to give it a very, very unique place in the history of Israel or even of the world. And this is done by adding it precisely here in the first creation account to show that even God observed this rest on the 7th day, and therefore all Israelites should be doing the same thing.
Right. Yeah, that certainly is a good motivation there, right? So I'm sure the audience will be very excited to hear what evidence you have to offer. So let's kind of get into that. So at the beginning of the article, you talk about the Worthberit and the Tatberit, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Could you talk about why these are important and just a good general understanding of what they are?
Yeah, well, these two things, I mean, it's taken from the German exegetical tradition, Wortbericht, and you can read it here. It means that God creates things through his divine speech and word, and Tatbericht means that this is done through action, like an artisan or something. It's more like we have it in the second creation account in Genesis 2, where God also forms certain things and makes them. And these two ideas are a basic pattern of the entire creation account, not only the passages I'm looking into here. And when you read it, you see that these are actually two distinct ideas of how things were created. And well, in fact, strictly speaking, they are mutually exclusive. Either God creates things by saying, let this be there, and then the text always says, and it was so, and then the thing is done. I mean, creation is done. And then again, there's a different and some kind of concurring pattern where it says, and God did this and that, and things came into being. So these two things are in a way mutually exclusive, and they have been, although combined here in this priestly creation account. So this is something quite interesting for the basic pattern or basic structure of this text, that these two ideas of how God created the world, the more sophisticated one of the Wortbericht, of word creation, and the more down-to-earth one of deed creation, have been brought together. And this has happened, according to my reading, at a stage earlier or prior to the one I'm discussing here. So the editorial reworkings, bringing in the Sabbath, they already presuppose that these two patterns have been combined.
Okay, all right. And in your paper, you talked about how the Wortbericht is dependent on the Tatbericht. So could you talk about the specific words are the Tatbericht is comprehensible on its own and may have once existed independently. Could you talk about how one's dependent on the other?
Yeah, right. I mean, I already mentioned that the Wortbericht, the word creation pattern, is the more sophisticated one. It is, I think, it's inspired by prophetic theology. So it brings in this notion that preceding to everything that happens, there has to be a divine order, a divine word, like we have it in the prophetic books, where always God says something and then these things happen. So it's somehow the reverse order. So this gives us a certain hint towards the diachronic relationship between the two, that the Wortbericht, the more sophisticated one, is perhaps the later one. But if we look at the entire text of Genesis 1, we can see that in certain passages, the Wortbericht is apparently, it's not comprehensible without the Tatbericht, which leads me to the idea that it is some kind of supplement, someone has added this to give it a more sophisticated notion in agreement with the prophetic theology. And in this passage on the luminaries, for instance, you can see that the Wortbericht only refers to the lights, that there be lights, but it doesn't state which lights. I mean, of course, it's sun and moon. And the only place where you learn this, the only passage that we are talking about, the sun, the moon, and the stars, is in fact the Tatbericht. So this, at least in this instance, it would make sense to say, the Wortbericht was written against the background of the already existing Tatbericht.
Okay, so just for people that are having a hard time conceptualizing it, so you have Genesis 1:14, and God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. So this would be the wort. Is this the Wortbericht or the Tatbericht?
That's the Wortbericht. That's the one which has this idea of God saying something and then only stating, and it was so. That's all. It all happened according to how God commanded.
Awesome. And so these are German words, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so people are learning some German today. That's fun.
Yeah,
all right.
that's good.
And then you have the Tatbericht, where you have God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. So this one right here, the one on the screen now, is the Wortbericht, and then the next one, God actually doing the work, is the Tatbericht. All right, so
and this latter one is completely comprehensible without the preceding one. You can only read this section, and it makes complete sense. You don't need to know that in advance God said something. So this seems to be the core of the entire thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so with that being said, Uh, yeah, so the first one you mentioned included the greater light to rule the day and the lesser night to rule the night. In between the sentence of Genesis 1:16, God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So
Mhm.
you might write in your paper that there might be an editorial addition here. Um,
Right.
yeah, could you talk about that?
Okay, so just to clarify, we're not talking about a state of development where Wortbericht and Tatbericht are already combined, but only in
Uh,
their most basic form. And now we're looking at certain editorial additions in this combined section. And we start with the Tatbericht, this is the second thing. And well,
okay.
you referred to verse 16, and
Mm,
something that really struck me is that we read here, and you have it even clearer in the Hebrew, that God made the two great light, the Me'orot HaGedulim, the two great lights.
mhm,
And then we have this, well, this parenthesis that somehow explains what these lights are. But the strange thing is that the two great lights, um, all of a sudden, there's only one great light. And the English translation says the greater light, but the
mm,
Hebrew is quite clear in this respect. It's the great light to rule the day, and the lesser light, that's the small light in Hebrew, to
mhm,
rule the night. So this is somehow a slight contradiction to what we read in the beginning of this verse, that there are two great lights, two great lights. And then if we bring this
mm,
together, we have, well, quite a strange phenomenon with the stars, because the reference to the stars is now somehow trailing away at the end of this verse. You know, it's he made the two great lights and the stars. And these two observations, this odd position of the stars that somehow seems out of place, and the idea or the observation that that parenthesis clarifies what the two great lights are, and at the same time contradicts the idea that they are two equally great lights, or that one can call both of them great lights.
mm,
These two things brought together led me to the conclusion, and I'm not the first one to conclude that this parenthesis, in fact, was added by a later editor who had some problems with assuming that these two lights are equal. And we have a lot of documented calendrical
mm,
discussions and debates in, well, in early Judaism, where people really thought about the different calendrical systems, if they're aligned towards the moon or the sun. And
mm.
this kind of debate seems to be reflected in this, I would claim, secondary passage, which tries to clarify that only the sun is the great light. And if we leave this out, we have a very smooth text which says God made the two great lights and the stars. And that seems to be the basic reading of this verse.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, so there's a rabbinic midrash which is really fun. It says, let's see, it says, the great luminaries, they were created equal, but the moon was shrunk since it challenged, saying, it is impossible for two kings to make use of the same crown. So,
Mhm.
so that was their, I guess, way to understand that passage, which
Right.
doesn't make much sense at all.
Right, but I mean it's always quite helpful to have a look at the rabbinic exegetical
Right.
tradition, because quite often these people are struggling with certain problems or observations, and they try to make sense out of, well, contradictions we find in the text, and they do it in the way you just quoted. And
Mm,
well, modern exegesis would perhaps say that it is likely to assume an editorial reworking of a text to account for such a contradiction.
mm. I see. Okay. All right. And okay, with that being said, in that case, so I could see how some people would be like, "Well, that's weird." Like if I myself was going to edit just a random book today, I would want to make sure that there were no contradictions to make sure the text just makes sense.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
do you don't think that the person who might have done this would be thinking about that? They would be worried those types of contradictions?
Well, I think that it's a different way of reworking text or of working with text than we have it today. And of course, today we would just use a word processor and we just delete the sequence, and then we would reformulate the text and we have a smooth text. But that's not the way these editors worked. Apparently, I mean, the evidence is right in front of our eyes. So we have it here, and we have all these tangents, and we can see quite often also in the manuscript evidence that we have different versions of one and the same passage, and they only differ quite slightly. And the things they differ in are these minor corrections. One is missing in the one manuscript, and it's there in the other manuscript. So that's just a fact. I mean, that's not only the imagination of an exegete, but that's what we can really see in the documented evidence. And apparently, these things that cause tensions, at least to our way of reading text, they were meant to be read as some kind of lens through which you should read the text. So it would be, God made the two great lights, and now I clarify that you should understand it the following way, namely the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. So that's how the person who added this wanted it to be understood. And of course, it's a correction, but well, the meaning or the idea that this person had is I think it's quite clear. And still, we wouldn't be doing it in the same manner, but these people obviously did.
Okay, I see. Okay. So what I would recommend for my audience is one, not take this as you have to accept this or you don't have to accept this. It's just more of a, it's possible, maybe likely, maybe not likely. It's not one or the other where you have to believe it or you don't have to believe it. And then on the other hand, so we're going to be talking about a number of different instances in the text where something's weird is going on. So you don't even have to accept one thing. You can accept one and not the others, or vice versa. You don't want to throw out all of the good points just because you don't think maybe one of the argumentation's good or something like that. Yes, let's moving on. So next you say the secondary apposition in Genesis 1:16 defines the roles of the sun and the moon through the motif of their dominion over the day and night. So what makes you think this phrase was added?
Well, that's basically the thing I explained recently. The idea that this is the phrase that interrupts this more basic thread of two great lights and the stars.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. And let's see here. Was there anything about, maybe I messed up with my notes, but of course, Genesis 1:17, it says, God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth and to rule over the day and over the night. Is there anything in Genesis 1:18 that and to rule over the day and over the night that you found interesting?
Well, I mean, we will get to that because the idea of separating light from darkness is something that will become quite crucial when we look at the editorial history of the preceding section. But of course, to rule over the day and over the night, so this first part of verse 18 is certainly related to the similar idea in verse 16, where it says that the greater light is to rule the day and the lesser light is to rule the night. So I would take these two passages as belonging to the same editorial reworking. So of course, the idea that these luminaries are rulers over day and night is one and the same in both verses, and therefore if we have a reason to assume that it was added in one verse, of course it makes sense to assume that it was also added in the other one.
Okay. So specifically in your article, you say the repetition of the same motive in a verse that offers three back-to-back reasons for why God places the luminaries in the sky is probably from the same editorial hand. So it seems
Mhm.
like the logic is the writer is giving three back-to-back reasons when that's not necessary to give the reason for it. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And then you say it is evident that the primary purpose for the luminaries was to give light, yet the
Mhm.
analysis of the text suggests originally this was their only purpose.
Mhm.
So maybe could you go into more detail about that?
Yeah, well, one part of the answer can be given when we look at this verse, this section 16 through 18,
Mm,
where we have the notion of the dominion of the two great lights over day and night. And as I
mm,
just argued, it appears that this motif here, that this purpose of the luminaries is comes from a certain editorial rationale and was added only later. The
mhm,
second one, to separate the light from darkness, that's the one we have here in verse 18 as well. This goes back to, well, another editorial rationale, but we can see even better that this was added when we look at the other section, namely the Wortbericht, the verses 14 through 15. That's the preceding two verses.
mm. Okay. So, and just for some clarity, so it seems like verse 17, that would be the first justification, which
Yeah,
is to give light upon the earth, and then 18 to rule over the day and night, day over and over the night. So that'd be the
right.
second justification, and then third one is to separate the light from the darkness.
Right. That's the one. And the first one also seems to be the primary one in a reduction historical purpose. So the original reading
Yep.
would be God made the two great lights and the stars, and God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. That's what
Mm,
all of these luminaries do.
mm. Much appreciated. Okay. So that is so this is the Talberit here, and so let's go into the Wortberit, the it's basically the God said part. Um,
Mhm.
all right. So in at 14 and verses 14 and 15, you talk about that. Um, uh, yeah. So I'll go ahead and put that on the screen here. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, so this is the text before what you would say is something weird's going on. So could you talk about what you think might be going on in this text?
Yeah. Well, when you read this very carefully, there is one really striking feature that needs to be explained. God says, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky,"
Hmm.
and then some purposes to separate the day from night and so on.
Hmm.
And then verse 15 continues, "And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And this is a very, very peculiar phenomenon because, well, what the text says is, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky, and let these lights be lights in the dome of the sky," which doesn't make very much sense, it appears. However, this phenomenon is a well-known editorial technique, and we have it in many, many instances in the Hebrew Bible. It's also a German word, which is literarische Wiederaufnahme, and you can translate this with resumptive repetition. And this is an editorial means to add a certain phrase to a given context by
Hmm.
picking up the final lemma where you entered it. So if we look at this again, or perhaps this one is even better. Thank you. So God says, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky," and then the text originally continued with "to give light upon the earth," which is, well, quite a nice sentence. And then someone added, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky." That's the original text. And he added another purpose, to separate the day from the night and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Again, a calendrical issue. And then he repeats, he picks up again the original phrase, "and let them be lights in the dome of the sky," to, well, to recreate the original connection we had in the text. So it's a means to establish, well, the same the same flow of the text.
Hmm.
Um, by repeating the earlier phrase where you added your editorial expansion. So that's the basic thing here, and this, at least to someone who's been working with these editorial techniques for quite a long time, this is quite a strong evidence to assume that the phrase in between this repetition, so namely to separate the day from day and night, that this is something that was added by precisely this editorial means. That was introduced in this earlier phrase, which was much more simple and simply claimed, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And that this is it, basically. And again here, as in the preceding Tagbericht, in the following Tagbericht, it's the basic rationale that these lights in the dome of the sky are supposed to give light. And that's what they do, and nothing more.
I see. Yeah, and this is on the screen where if you remove that odd piece of information, it flows very nicely. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth," and it was so. Very nice and smooth. Right. Yeah. So next, you say that this Wort has gone through several editorial expansions after the MT. I would assume that's the Masoretic text, and then so many might be confused by this phrase because they think that the Masoretic text was written way later, in medieval times, after the Old Greek and Latin text. So before we really get into the text there, could you explain why you would say that it's gone through editorial expansions after the Masoretic text?
Yeah, well, what I'm referring here, one could also say, it would perhaps be more precise to say the Proto-Masoretic text. Of course, you're right that what we call, in a strict sense, what we call the Masoretic texts are indeed medieval textual witnesses. But still, all these different textual traditions go back to ancient versions that are, well, not entirely, but partially attested in the Qumran manuscript. So we have the Proto-Masoretic text, the one which I refer to here by saying the MT. And we also have a Proto-Samaritan text, that is the one where the Samaritan Pentateuch was based upon later on. And then we also have a tradition, a Hebrew tradition, which was obviously taken by the translators of the Septuagint. And this is all attested in different manuscripts in Qumran. And the thing I'm referring to here is the Proto-Masoretic version, which in this particular case, seems to be earlier or more original than the other attested versions. But only in this case. If we look 3 verses down, it might be just the other way around. You never know.
Yeah. So you have the Masoretic texts, most date around medieval times, and then you're referring to what they call the Proto-Masoretic text. So even though it's dated much later, we have really good reason to think that that text was actually has an earlier tradition, essentially, than even the Greek or the Samaritan Pentateuch we have today. So the Greek text, that's around 3rd century BC. And then the Latin text, or the Samaritan Pentateuch, could you talk about when those datings are before we get into that?
Well, I think for the things we're discussing here, it would suffice to really say that all 3 versions I'm referring to here, the Proto-Masoretic, the Proto-Samaritan text, and the Vorlage, the Hebrew version that was translated into Greek, that all of them are contemporary. They are all already attested in the Qumran manuscripts. And that still these versions somehow witness different ways in which the textual development went, and that later on this continued, and then the Samaritans, they took this Proto-Samaritan version, added other things, and in the Greek that's a very complicated thing. The Greek tradition, it's an awful lot of manuscripts we have there.
Mm.
And the old Latin, the Vetus Latina, is another thing which was translated from the Greek. So it's a translation of a translation. And still, there are sometimes instances where it preserves quite an early Hebrew text. Not in this case, however. So what we're looking at here are basically contemporary witnesses. And what I try to show is that the tensions that grew into the text through these supplementations were observed by writers and were tried to they tried to mend it, to harmonize the different passages. And and this is, for me, it's another piece of evidence to show that this editorial process really happened, because it created problems. It tried to solve problems. It tried to make certain points that were not there in the text previously, but at the same time, it resulted in certain tensions, certain contradictions, and as very often, already the earliest textual tradents, they recognized this and they tried to cope with it in a way, and that's what they did by adding certain passages. So they took the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Old Greek text and also the Vetus Latina. They add this phrase, to give light upon the earth, which opens the second part, the Tatbericht. So it stands at the beginning of the purposes mentioned in verse 17, but not in verse 14. It's missing there. And they just took it. It's a way of harmonizing these two passages and said, well, we need to have this as well. That's the primary purpose. So they added this phrase in verse 14 as well as the primary purpose. So in these textual versions, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Old Greek, and the Vetus Latina, the verse 14 starts with let there be lights in the dome of the sky. That's the Proto-Masoretic text as well. But then they all add this phrase, to give light upon the earth, and they do not start with to separate the day from the night, as we have it in the Proto-Masoretic version. So this would be a way, the boldened text here, it would be a way to align this section with the section 117, where we have to give light upon the earth as the primary purpose. So Tatbericht and Wortbericht are aligned with each other. That's my point here.
Okay, so just for clarifying to my audience here, so you can see. All right, so the phrase you're talking about, where the Samaritan Pentateuch does something a little odd, is, so it says, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." So the phrase "to give light upon the earth," and that's not in the Masoretic text, correct?
Right.
Okay.
But it's in verse 17 of the Masoretic text and of all other versions. And this is, they just wanted to have a precise parallel between these two passages. They should be alike precisely, and that's why they harmonized the text by adding one phrase taken from the other part of the text.
Yeah, okay. And so you talked about why they did it. So I guess just for like parallelism, essentially. I guess for people in today, they might think that's just a little weird. Like, why think that's like why would someone feel the need to just make a parallel there? It's not like the text is missing something, right? Or it's not wrong because it's missing there.
Yeah, well, but I mean, apparently the texts are there. That's attested evidence, and we have to explain it some way why these differences are attested in the different versions. And it becomes more and more sacred, and people are more and more concerned with smoothing out certain oddities, because, well, they would ask, why does it say, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky," but there's no reference to that they are supposed to give light upon the earth? it only comes in verse 15, so as the last purpose, while in the following section it is the primary purpose. So this is odd. I mean, I'm sorry, the text refers to the same thing, and therefore they just try to harmonize this by adding this purpose of giving light also to the first passage.
I see. So essentially, maybe the logic is something like the verse. It seems like maybe it's missing something. It's missing the purpose. So we should add that, because maybe the original text, maybe we just have a copy that's wrong, and maybe we should fix it to be the original text, because they assume that must have been the original text. Do you think that could have been the logic there?
In a way, yes, and only really trying to show that this text, and again we have this oddity with the two patterns, the Wortbericht and the Tatbericht, and this is something people also, of course, they noticed it, and it is strange that these two things do not preserve the same phrases. It's a doublet in a way, and then still the purposes do not occur in the same way, and that's what people just try to bring in line with each other.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there now. Okay, awesome. All right, thank you so much. And so the Septuagint, the Old Greek, and the Latin versions do something somewhat similar. So could you talk about that for us here?
Yeah, I mean, in the Latin version, we have you have it right here on the screen. You have this underlined passage. This is also added from the Wortbericht, from the Tatbericht, that is from verses 17 through 18, to this Wortbericht, this word creation account, because also this is missing here in this first part, that they are supposed to rule over day and night. That's the one editorial expansion we discussed earlier in verse 16 and 18, that this is the main purpose, but we have it only in the second part of this passage. That means in verse 16 through 18. And strangely, this idea of dominion is simply absent here in the first part. But and people, I think they will have asked, well, this refers to precisely the same creation process. Why then is this crucial element of the second part missing in the first part? And then they added it to the first part. That's what the old Latin tradition, at least, it does this. So it has an even fuller harmonization between the two passages than the Greek and the Samaritan text.
Okay, so just for some clarity there, so what was the specific phrase? Was it to give light upon the earth that they added, or was it and to rule over day and night?
To rule over the day and over the night. So we have it in verse 16. That's our parenthesis, the greater light to rule the day, this motif, and we have it in verse 18. But it's not there, this idea of the great light's dominion. It's not there in verse 14 or 15. And that's what apparently struck later readers, and they, at least the Vetus Latina, the old Latin text, does that. They took this motif of dominion and also added it in verse 14.
Yeah, that's pretty. It's pretty. Looking at it from a 21st century view of just how we look at the text, it's very odd that they would do something like that. But it's very interesting to think about there. So later in the paper, you argue that Genesis 2:1 and Genesis 1:1 are added to begin and end. Actually, before we get into that, could you talk about what you think happened with day one?
Yeah. So if we summarize our findings so far, we see that apparently this passage 1:14 through 18 on the luminaries has gone certain stages of editorial reworking on. One of them refers to the separation of light and darkness, or of day and night. That's the one of the purposes given here. As I claimed, this is something that is quite likely editorial in verse 14, 15, through this resumptive repetition. And this terminology we have here to separate lehavdil in Hebrew is precisely the terminology we find in the first work of creation in Genesis 1, 3 through 5, with the creation of light, because the main purpose of the creation of light is to separate between light and darkness, and thereby to establish the change between day and night. So this most elementary pattern of human time reckoning, perhaps. And if we bring these two things together, we can assume that the secondary portions in the luminary section were introduced to bring this in line with the also secondary passage on the creation of light, because now the purpose of the primordial light is somehow transferred to the luminaries. Now it's, once they are created, they shall continue what has been done before. So that's the basic idea. This passage here, you can read it now, Genesis 1, 3 through 5, introduces day and night by the motif of God creating light. And this seems to be connected to something that is clearly secondary in the passage on the luminaries, namely this notion of separating between. And as a redaction critic, I always try to do it as simple as possible. And my explanation would be that the evidence taken together is explained easiest by assuming that all these separation materials belong to the same editorial version. That is, the one who added this notion of separating day from night in the luminary section did so because he also edited the section on day and night, on the primordial light in Genesis 1, 3 through 5. And then we shall, of course, we need to ask, why did someone add this section? Because we already had the luminaries. I mean, they are there in the process of creation. And the only function, the only necessity for having this section on the creation of light right at the beginning is to introduce the day count, the 7-day count. There is no other really important purpose. People argue, well, that's necessary for the works of creation to develop, and you can have a lot of sophisticated thoughts why you need light from the very beginning, but in the logic of the text, the only clear purpose is what we have here in verse 5. There was evening, there was morning, the first day. So this brings me back to my earliest argument, that when people try to introduce the Sabbath into this text, they somehow needed to introduce a count of night and day, or of 7 days. And you needed to have something to measure day and night. That there was nothing, and you needed to have it from the very beginning, because the idea was that the entire process of creation took 6 days and God rested on the 7th day. So, you needed light from the very beginning to have this distinction between day and night. And for this reason, someone added the creation of light to prepare for this Sabbath etiology. And at the same time, they also aligned the section on the luminaries, which had been there already, with this new purpose, the separation. So that's where the motif of separating between day and night comes into the luminary section from this passage that we see here. And this all serves the purpose of introducing the 6-7-day structure to have this marvelous Sabbath etiology in the creation account.
Okay, so just for my audience and maybe a little my clarity too. So this idea of separating, of course, you see that in Genesis day 2 and day 3, but um, so it's so you're not arguing that like those are related to day one, are you? Like, could you one more time? Could you talk about what's going on with the separating, and how is that related to day four if there is a relationship?
Yeah, well, I do not doubt that the motif of separating things also occurs in the well, what we call now day two and so on. But it's something that is not related to light or to day or to time reckoning. The two sections here, Genesis 1, 3 through 5, the first day, and the creation of the luminaries on the fourth day, they are terminologically linked by these phrases that say to separate the day from night, and to separate the light from darkness. So that's quite a very, very clear connection between these two passages. And verse 5 prepares for what we read in the luminary section by saying that God has light and darkness, and he calls the one day and he calls the other thing night. And therefore, this introduces what we have then in Genesis 1:14, where we have the separation of day and night. So these things are, well, I think they are evidently related to each other. And as I tried to show earlier, the idea of separating day from night in the luminary section is apparently secondary. It does not belong there, while it belongs to the core of this first day, the creation of light. And that's what made me argue that this is in fact part of one and the same editorial reworking, which introduces the first light to have a day count from the very beginning. And this is then somehow aligned with the creation of the luminaries in verse 14.
I see. Okay, so I'll remove that. So what you have in verse 4 is this idea of separating the light from the darkness, and then verse 18 also separating the light from the darkness.
And verse 14, I mean, that's where this addition comes in. That's where we have this repetitive resumption,
day from the night,
to separate the day from the night. And that's this is clearly based on verse 3, 4, and 5. But it is not, as far I would argue, it's not part of this original thing. And thereby I try to solve this problem that we cannot explain. How do luminaries and primordial light relate? What sense? My solution would be, in the beginning there were only the luminaries, and they were only created in the process of creation. And only with the Sabbath etiology, someone added the idea that this was a day count from the very beginning, and that in order to have this day count, one needed a separation between light and darkness and night and day from the very beginning, even before there were luminaries. And that's what created the text as it is now.
Much appreciated. All right. So what you'll see at the very bottom of the screen is, of course, day one. And I wanted to show what it would look like. Hey, if you take out day one, how does that flow? And what you'll see on the screen here is, and Genesis 1:1 as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it says, the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then you have day 2, and God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the water from the water. So it flows. The subject of the talk of Genesis 1:2 is about the waters, and then it flows perfectly to Genesis 1:6 talking about the waters.
Right. And the separation here is something amidst the chaos. There's not a separation between light and darkness, but there is this original chaos, and God creates order by erasing this dome or ordering this dome to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not missing the light. That's I think an important point. You can read it quite smoothly from verse 2 to verse 6, and
Mm.
it's not really necessary for anything except the day count.
Yeah.
You only need it for the day count.
Right. Yeah. So something I did find interesting was that so you have separating in the text we have today, we have separating in day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, but not in day 5 and 6. Um, so I don't know if there's anything to that there, but I did like when we look at the text today, it seems like there's like a day 1 to 3 parallelism with days 4 to 6. Would you agree with that?
At least in the present state of the text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason I point out that it seems like there's 4 days of separating is I would have expected 3. So the origin of that or what's going on, I'm not sure, but I did find that interesting.
Well, I mean, this has, of course, people have always discussed the parallels to the Babylonian creation myths, and this idea of separating in the primordial chaos, or in the chaotic forces, or however you want to call this,
Yep.
is something that might derive from there. This idea that God, the god, the deity Baal, also fighting this chaos creature Tiamat and slaying it, and then from this corpse the world is created, and this also goes by separating certain things, and one can think about whether this might be inspired from this mythical sphere of the Babylonians, perhaps.
Yeah, just I'm sure you realize this, but you said Baal. I think you meant Marduk. Is that right?
Sorry, yeah, that was my mistake.
Yeah. That's okay. You didn't prepare to specifically talk about that. I actually interviewed Eckhart Fromm on the very topic of the relationship between Genesis 1 and the Anomalous show. People can check out that interview. Really interesting stuff. So to keep going there, Genesis 2:1 and Genesis 1:1. Some scholars that have argued that Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement of the creation text have noted that there's a parallelism there. But you mentioned that maybe something else is going on with these different ways that maybe the text we have today might have been formed. I'll put those on the screen. So you have Genesis 1, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, and then after day 6, it says, "Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all their multitude." Could you talk about what you think's going on there?
Well, I believe that this is the most original frame around this creation account. I mean, it is obvious that these two verses are clearly related. The one opens the whole thing, and the one the other two one concludes the whole thing. What I argue is, and I refer to this at the very beginning today, that the concluding passage in 2:2, which says the same things in a more differentiated way, by saying that God finished the work on the 7th day, or on the 6th day. The versions do not agree here. That this phrase is apparently a way of clarifying this basic concluding statement, and this is, I mean, in verse 1, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude," there are no traces of the Sabbath, right? We don't see the Sabbath here. And then we have another concluding statement just in the following verse, "And on the 7th day God finished the work he had done." So this is something that I read as another argument in favor of my idea, and the idea of others, of course, that the Sabbath, together with the creation of light and the day count and all these other editorial things, does not belong to this original passage, or to the original earliest version of this creation account, because, as you showed us, verse 1:1 and 2:1, they are a perfect frame, and verse 2:2 picks up the same thing again, the key word finish, the Hebrew word for finish, and then it goes on and says, yes, they were finished, but they were finished precisely on the seventh day, or perhaps more likely the sixth day, as the Greek version and others read here. But that's a huge debate. But the important thing is I think it's quite convincing evidence to say, also here we can see evidence that the idea of the Sabbath and the connection to the 7-day count is not part of the basic version of this account.
Yeah. And if I'm remembering it correctly, the whole, well, just for pointing out for the audience first, so Genesis 2:2, it says, on the seventh day, God finished the work. And then, that's the Masoretic text we have today. But the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Peshitta, they have sixth day. It says, on the sixth day, God finished the work. So I've heard that some scholars have postulated that maybe it says that sixth day instead of seventh is because it says that God finished the work. It doesn't say that he did any work on there. Maybe is that the view you take, or is there anything else there?
Apparently the versions reflect a debate about what finishing on day X means and how this is to be interpreted. And of course, the basic pattern is you work for 6 days, and then seventh day, this is the day of rest. Yeah. That's the basic idea behind the Sabbath. And therefore, the perhaps more, the reading that is more in accord with this is, of course, the Septuagint reading, which says, on the sixth day, everything is done, and and on the seventh day, God rests from the work he has done.
Yes, much appreciated. All right, thank you so much. So, was there any other thing, any detail we hadn't talked about that you wanted worth mention before we start to get going?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
I think we covered most of it.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on here and talking with us today. As far as your work goes, you've written a number of different papers and some books. Was there anything that you wanted my audience to know about? Maybe they can check out more of your work.
You mean referring to my literature or the things I published? Well, you can all look it up on the internet, on my webpage from the University of Kiel. You find a lot of other redaction, critical analysis, and also other publications that might further illuminate this approach. To me, it's a very helpful thing to really understand the text as it is, and that's the only thing I try to do here. As you said earlier, you don't need to buy every argument, but you should have an explanation for the text. So if you don't buy my argument, which of course you're free to do or not to do, still people should try to find explanations for the things I try to explain by assuming editorial reworkings.
Yes. Yeah, so something's going on in it, and you have to have some understanding of how it got that way, or why the writer would have written it like that if you don't accept your view. So, what you've done is tried to present the most probable one, the most probable way of getting what we have today. But otherwise, I do appreciate you coming on here. Thank you so much. I would definitely recommend people check out your other work. A lot of great stuff there. And but otherwise, I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.